Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Just whatever where everybody is around the world. It's wonderful to speak to you all. And really, I probably would never stay up quite past my bedtime unless I had an opportunity to talk to such a diverse group of people doing wonderful things around the country, around the globe, about climate change. So I do have little slides, and I wonder if I'm going to be able to share them because I did not send them to Laurie in advance, but let's see if that works. Can everybody see that? All right. Everybody just want to say yes or no?
Yes.
People said, okay, I'm going to do it from that work better?
Wonderful.
Great. Okay. So you thought I was going to talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about climate change. This is a slide about climate change. This is my 3 children, not how they exist now. They're a bit older now. The twins are 8 and my teenager is 15. Why I almost start a lot of presentations with pictures of my 3 children is it wasn't until I connected climate change with my kids, until I made it really personal, that I kind of shifted from being generally concerned about climate change. I believed the science. If I'd done a survey, I would have ticked, worried about climate change, government should do more. But it really wasn't until about 4 or so years ago that I made that connection between climate change and its risks to me personally, and the benefits to me personally on acting about climate change. And I'm 51 now, so it's quite late in life. We know that the science around climate change has been circulating for 30 years. What was the trigger for me to kind of move from highly concerned about climate change to genuinely alarmed? And I changed a lot of my behaviour. In fact, I reoriented a lot of my profession to focus on climate change. Well, it was actually the climate strikes in Australia and all around the world. And I remember seeing some of these young people. It was mostly young people to start with. Obviously, lots of other people march with them. But it was seeing these young people on television, and I was thinking, oh, isn't it good they're kind of, putting down the iPads and getting on the street and, protesting and telling the older generation that they need to do something. And then, of course, it hit me. I am now the older generation. And it really felt at that moment that these young men and women, not at that stage much older than my teenage daughter, were really speaking to me about, well, what is it that you're doing to stop this? Because we can't vote. We don't necessarily have a lot of consumer power. But you do. And it really was that really kind of transformative moment that, I got up from the couch. I made a whole series of decisions about where I invest my money, where I get the energy in my home, what my next car purchase was going to be, changed the way I ate, as well as started to write the book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. So that kind of personal story gives you a little bit of an insight into what is really reaffirmed by all the social research, not just in this country, but around the world, that really gives us some understanding of why some people take climate change very personally and others don't, and some hints about how to effectively talk about climate change. And this kind of very kind of fancy slide, but really basically breaks down some fundamental principles that all the social science tells us about how you can actually talk about climate change to people who may not necessarily be, really concerned about climate and acting on it. And also some kind of tips about when you are thinking about how you engage people and talk about climate change, what, again, the social science shows is most effective. One of the biggest barriers to people talking about climate change is their anxiety that they're not knowledgeable about the science. And a big part of that anxiety is because we've had decades of, let's just say, a lot of I suppose, conflict in the public sphere about whether the climate science is accurate or not. And people watch that, they think, oh, this is really complicated, and people with PhDs and politicians are arguing about it, so how could I possibly talk about it? I think one of the most important things is that if experts, if people with PhDs on climate science were the ones that were going to convince the public that climate change is happening and we have to do something, well, then we would already be there. And that's not a criticism of scientists at all. Their job is to be scientists, not necessarily always to communicate their science to people. But it isn't always that you have to have all the facts and all the details to engage with people and talk to people. So you do not have to be an expert on climate change to talk about it. You merely have to be a human being that cares. I spent a lot of time advising a lot of different groups around Australia on how to talk about climate. So people who are famous sports people and parents and doctors and a whole lot of other people about it. And you have to know some basics about climate science, but you also, what you really need to know is that there is a vast majority, the scientific evidence is so overwhelming. The kinds of institutions that Australians particularly really trust, like our Bureau of Meteorology and our key institutions like the CSIRO are telling us it's happening. So I kind of trust them. And then you kind of really need to move on. Once you get bogged down in the weeds of the climate science, you're losing people. So like I said, you don't have to be an expert. The other thing that I think people should always realise is that you're already powerful. A lot of people kind of say, well, I might care about climate change. What can I do? What impact can I make as an individual? And so when people ask me that question, I say, well, think about the networks and organisations that you're already part of. Rotary is a great example of that. Maybe you're part of a parents' network. Maybe you're a really esteemed employee in your firm. Maybe you play a really important role in your sporting club. Those networks of trust and influence can already be leveraged to help you talk about climate change. So I also think about those. You don't necessarily have to go out and join Greenpeace and run for Parliament or run for Congress or any of those other kinds of things. Think about, like I said, the networks of influence and leverage you already have and use them. A really important part of how to communicate climate change is understand your audience. What do they value? What matters to them? Particularly if that audience is different for you and, of course, are different from you. And a big part of this is really understanding why they think about climate change the way they do. So being a really active listener, asking really open questions, not necessarily kind of barreling in with all the science and your views. I'm always fascinated, when I talk to people about getting their understanding of, how they've experienced the extreme weather we've had in Australia. Have they ever watched something about climate change on television or seen something on social media? What captured their attention? Have they ever had a conversation with people about climate change? What do their kids talk to them about? Do their kids talk to them about climate change? Really engaging and understanding that audience. And I'll be talking a little bit about a really important tool that, a really important piece of research that I've been involved in for some time that helps us really understand those audiences. Understanding your own climate story. I mean, I kind of started with my climate story at the beginning of this with pictures of my children and the galvanising moment of watching the climate strikes. But I think if you have a really compelling story about what's brought you to climate change, and it could have been something that happened personal in your life or experience you had in nature or some kind of revelation you had through your work, something you saw on television, maybe you had dinner with David Attenborough, something like that, or just watched all these wonderful TV shows. That is really important. It's really hard to dismiss a person's personal story. Some of the stories I love the most is when I hear grandparents say there was that moment, when they had their grandchild and they suddenly realised, I want to make sure that they grow up in a safe world where they will one day have the opportunity to have a grandchild. So these really powerful emotional stories about connection, and why we value the things we do are really important. And that connects to that next one that I'm talking about here, which is start your climate story and start the way that you communicate with climate about what I call in the book, and what's been called in some of the work around this, called objects of care, the things we matter. I don't really care about climate change. I care about the things that climate change are going to take away, affect and destroy. And so I act on climate change because I want to protect those things. And so starting with the science, or starting with I really care about climate change, is not always the best way, particularly to engage people who are disengaged from this issue. But starting about the things that matter to them are really important. And to go back to, I said, some of the work that I'm doing with professional sports people in Australia who are really passionate about climate change. I think every country's got their own passions about sport, but Australians are particularly fanatical about sport. It's wonderful to work with these football players who are saying, well, you know, during the fires, we couldn't train because you couldn't go outside because you couldn't breathe. And, you know, there was that season where, you know, we had so much extreme water that we couldn't really play, you know, community sport clubs couldn't play. And this is a game that we've played for 100 years and we want to play for another 100 and 200 years, but the game is under threat. So starting with that object of care, I think, is really important, what matters to you. And again, I think linking climate action with what you value, but also the values that you have. And whatever those values are, again, I've done quite a lot of work, sometimes with corporations, but also with organisations. So to think about what some of the core values they've had, and perhaps they've had those values if they're heritage organisations, you know, organisations like Scouts for, like, you know, decades, if not centuries. How can we link climate action to a kind of modern articulation of those values? And I think finally, one of the problems that we have about climate change when we're communicating, particularly if we're communicating in visually, not just in terms of words and so forth. So we tend to show both the impacts and solutions to climate change without people in them. So, you know, I do a lot of work as a social researcher where we test communications and campaign materials, and clients think that they need to show, you know, to show climate change, they have to show kind of devastating fires, and to show the solutions, they just show, you know, endless rows of, you know, wind farms. We need to put people back into the impacts and the solution. Again, we have to make it personal. We have to connect it to those objects of care. Like I said, I'm not in love with solar panels, or not in love with wind farms, though I actually think they're pretty, and I kind of don't understand why people think they're ugly. But I am in love with the things that they can do to help me protect the things that I love as well. So I think when you're thinking about communication, really think carefully about the images you use. And increasingly, actually, Climate Outreach is an organisation that has a fantastic climate visuals library, which is publicly available. So if you're ever doing any material, and also kind of diverse, right? It doesn't all have to look like it's all come from the same countries. In the book, How to Talk About Climate Change, I interviewed a fantastic activist from the Philippines, and particularly passionate about the impact that climate was having on her country. And she was also a kind of ocean conservationist as well. And she said, you know, obviously a lot of work with global organisations that were constantly sending her campaign material with images of polar bears. And she said, we don't kind of have a lot of polar bears in the Philippines, and, you know, constantly talking about, you know, making sure that our images about climate change, the impacts and the solutions reflect the diversity of cultures across the world and also within countries. The next, how do I do this? What's my next? Oh, there we go. That's a little quote about this concept of object of care that I talked about, which is how this was a piece of extensive work done by some social scientists in Australia, saying that, you know, ways in which we can kind of link, one of the problems about climate change is it feels in many ways a very distant, global, big, overwhelming issue. And so there's a huge amount of psychological distance between the self and climate change. and that objects of care and kind of linking them to together can actually bridge that gap in many ways, and therefore encourage people to act. So I was talking a little bit about the importance of audiences. This is something called Climate Compass, which is a research project that's now been going on for a number of years. It's the methodology is taken from Yale and George Mason University's Six Americas study. So when I was writing the book, I went and spent some time with the wonderful social scientists at the Yale School that do this work. And this is something that they've done in 150 times in countries all around the world. So it's a segmentation, divides up the Australian community according to their attitudes to climate and their emotional response to climate. This is a quantitative piece of research that has guided the climate movement in Australia now for 4 years and was used extensively by climate positive politicians in the last election to great effect. So we now have a federal government with a good number of independent candidates that are really passionate about climate, a whole slew of new Greens candidates, and climate was an issue that really drove the vote towards the left of centre Labor Party. So it became a huge issue in the last election. And now we're playing a lot of catch up, having been behind the world for some time. When I talk about audience, talk about knowing that the kinds of messages that are going to get people who are already alarmed on climate acting are actually going to be quite different than if you're just merely concerned about climate or if you're cautious about climate as well. But I love showing this to people because I want people to understand that while we've had decades of amplified climate denial, of course, powerful climate deniers in the media and in politics, the Climate Compass in Australia, and indeed the climate compasses that have been done by Yale and George Mason around the world, show that the kinds of people who are dismissive of the science, and in fact climate deniers themselves, are less than 10% of the population. Everybody else is reachable, if not on the climate science, definitely on the climate solutions. That should embolden people that if you have some basic understanding of how to communicate, you can kind of find a way to talk to everybody. And as somebody who's tested a lot of campaigns and policy solutions with people who are doubtful and even still been able to kind of find a way to get through to them, I think people should feel confident that you can find a way to talk about climate change to almost everyone. So